sign it, Mom. The house is too big for you now." Daniel slid the document across the kitchen table. Patricia stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her eyes already moving over the cabinets, the walls, the rooms she had begun to price in her head. The pen sat beside Ruth's hand. Ruth did not pick it up. She was 78 years old. She had raised these 2 children in this house. She had buried their father from this kitchen. And now they had come on a Tuesday afternoon with a realtor's timeline and the quiet certainty of people who had already decided what was going to happen to their mother. Daniel tapped the paper. "The realtor comes tomorrow," he said. "This just makes everything easier." Ruth looked at the pen. Then her eyes moved past him down the back hallway to the old charcoal wool coat still hanging on the last hook by the laundry room door. Eleanor's coat. 30 years on that hook. No one had touched it. No one had wondered why Ruth had never moved it. But Ruth remembered now. She remembered a sentence her grandmother had said to her when she was 17 years old, standing in this exact kitchen. "If they ever try to take the house from you, don't argue. Go to the coat, then go downstairs." Ruth stood up slowly. Daniel said, "Mom, where are you going?" She didn't answer. She walked to the coat and reached into the left pocket. Her fingers found what had been there for 30 years, a small iron key tied with a strip of faded cloth. On the cloth in Eleanor's handwriting were 7 words. For Ruth, always, "Go below when they come." And at the end of the hallway, the basement door that had been locked since the day Eleanor died was waiting. Ruth looked at it. Then she looked back at her children. She said quietly, "Not yet, Daniel." And she walked toward the door. The morning her children arrived with the papers, Ruth Calloway had already made coffee, set out 2 mugs, and trimmed the rosemary bush by the front door. Eleanor had planted that bush 40 years ago and named it half-jokingly the Guardian. Ruth had always smiled at that. This morning she did not smile. She trimmed it carefully the way Eleanor had always trimmed it, taking only what needed taking and leaving the rest, and she went back inside and washed her hands at the kitchen sink and stood for a moment looking at the amber light coming through the window. It came through the same way every morning. Long and warm landing exactly on the chair where Eleanor used to sit with her first cup of coffee, and her unhurried stillness, the stillness of a woman who had decided long ago that mornings were not for rushing. Ruth had adopted the habit without meaning to. 3 years of mornings in this house had given her things she had not known she needed: the creak of the back porch stairs, the smell of old wood and lavender, the particular quality of light in a kitchen that had been a kitchen for 60 years and had the warmth of that in its walls. She had come here after Harold died. Daniel had suggested it briefly and kindly in the way he suggested things he had already half decided. "Go stay at Grandma Eleanor's place for a while, Mom, just until you find your footing." She had found her footing. She had found it so completely that the finding had become the living, and the temporary had become the only place that felt like herself. Eleanor had passed 4 years ago at 94 in the bedroom she had slept in since 1962, in the house she had kept with the same quiet competence she applied to everything. She had left no fortune, no jewelry collection, no portfolio of investments. She had left the farmhouse and 12 acres and the old barn and 37 years of memory tied to every door handle and window sill. Daniel and Patricia had attended the funeral and returned to their lives. Ruth had stayed. She had cleaned Eleanor's closets over months, slowly, not wanting to rush what deserved patience. She donated clothing in careful batches and kept the photographs and labeled boxes with a tenderness that surprised her sometimes when she stopped to notice it. She replanted Eleanor's herb garden in the spring. She oiled the kitchen cabinets when they started to stick. She had become, without entirely planning, to the keeper of the place, the person the house had chosen to stay. 8 weeks ago, Daniel had called with a different tone. Practical, prepared, the tone of a man who has done research and arrived at a conclusion before making the call. He had spoken with a realtor. The farmhouse sat on land a development company was acquiring across the county. The offer was substantial. It would cover Ruth's care for years comfortably. Patricia had followed up with a text and then a call and then a visit, and Ruth had understood, listening to the careful sequence of it, that they had discussed this between themselves for some time before bringing it to her. She had watched them through the kitchen window that morning before they knocked. They stood in the driveway together, speaking quietly, Patricia with her folder, and Sean with his hands in his pockets, and Daniel with the expression he wore when he was preparing to be patient. Ruth had watched them and felt something settle in her chest. Not anger and not grief exactly, but the quiet recognition of a thing she had hoped would not be true, and now had to accept was true. They came in. Daniel sat at the table. He explained slowly in the tone one uses for people who require extra time that the offer was good and the timing was right, and the proceeds divided appropriately would benefit everyone. Ruth had asked quietly what divided appropriately meant. The table went briefly silent. Patricia opened the folder. Sean refilled his own coffee without being asked. Daniel placed the pen beside Ruth's hand. "You're 78, Mom. What are you going to do with a farmhouse? Be reasonable." Ruth had looked at her son. She knew the exact shape of his face. She had held it in her hands when he was 3 days old, had kissed that forehead through fevers and disappointments, and the ordinary Tuesday mornings of a childhood she had tried to make feel safe. She knew looking at him now that he believed what he was saying. He had found a way, as people often did, to make the practical thing feel like the loving thing had folded the taking into the concern until the two were difficult to separate. She did not sign. She said she needed time. Daniel's jaw tightened in the way it had tightened since he was 12, and she had said no to something he wanted. Patricia mentioned the offer's expiration window. Sean stood near the counter and did not look at the unsigned document. After they left for the afternoon to let her consider, Ruth stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she walked to the hallway the way she walked when she needed to feel the house around her slowly, with attention letting the familiar things be familiar. The mirror with the dark frame, the photograph of Eleanor in her garden, 1978, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not a smile, but was better than a smile. The row of hooks by the laundry room door. Eleanor's coat hung on the last hook. Charcoal wool, old and soft, the coat of a woman who had worn it through decades of cold mornings and had hung it there the last time she came in from outside. Ruth had meant to donate it a dozen times. Every time she had taken it down, she had put it back. She could not have explained why. Some things simply belonged where they were. She reached into the left pocket without thinking, the way you reach for something familiar without deciding to. Her fingers closed around something cold and heavy. She stopped. She did not pull it out yet. She stood in the hallway with her hand in Eleanor's coat pocket and felt the weight of the thing against her palm and thought about a summer afternoon when she was 12 years old, sitting on this porch with a glass of water that Eleanor had pressed into her hands on a hot August day, and Eleanor saying in the unhurried way she said things she meant permanently, "People will try to take things from you your whole life, Ruth. The trick is knowing which things were always yours." Ruth stood very still. The house was quiet around her. The amber light had moved from the kitchen into the hallway now the way it moved through the afternoon, slowly and without urgency, illuminating one thing at a time. She kept her hand in the pocket. She was not ready to look at what was in it yet, but she knew with the particular certainty that comes from a lifetime of paying attention to the right things that Eleanor had put it there for her, and that Eleanor had never done anything without a reason. The key was small, iron old, the kind made before the 1970s when things were built to last, because the people making them assumed lasting was the point. The bow was simple, the barrel straight, the teeth worn in the particular way of a key that had opened something many times over many years and then at some point had stopped. Tied to the bow was a strip of faded cotton cloth, knotted twice with the deliberate double knot of someone who wanted to be certain it would hold. The handwriting on the cloth was in ink that had faded to the color of old tea, but remained legible, the careful, unhurried letters of a woman who had written things down her entire life, because she understood that written things outlasted the person who wrote them. For Ruth, always. Ruth read it 3 times, standing in the hallway. Then she carried it to the kitchen table and sat down with it the way you sit down, with something that requires your full attention, both hands around it, the morning light falling across the cloth, and the iron and the worn teeth of a key that had been waiting in an old coat pocket for however many years Eleanor had been gone. She turned it over slowly. It was not decorative. Eleanor had not been a decorative woman. Everything Eleanor had ever done had served a purpose, and this key had been placed in this pocket, on this coat, on this hook, with the same intention that Eleanor applied to everything which was complete and quiet and far-sighted in a way that only became clear after the fact. The cloth was old, but the knotting was deliberate. Eleanor had not simply dropped a key somewhere and hoped for the best. She had prepared this. She had tied the cloth and written the label and left it in the one coat Ruth had never been able to give away, the one coat that had stayed on its hook through 3 years of Ruth clearing and cleaning and donating in careful batches. Eleanor had known Ruth would not give away the coat. She had known it the way she knew most things about Ruth, which was completely and without needing to be told. The question was what the key opened. Ruth stood and walked the house slowly, holding the key, the way you hold a small compass when you are not yet sure of your direction. She tried the old roll-top desk in the study first because the desk had a lock, and the lock was old, and it seemed the logical place to begin. Wrong size the key, too small for the desk's barrel by half. She tried the garden shed padlock on her way through the back porch, standing in the cold October air for a moment, but the shed's lock was newer and larger, and the key bore no relationship to it. She tried the storage closet in the upstairs hall, the one with the original hardware from whenever the house had been built, but the keyhole was a different shape entirely. She moved through the house methodically, without hurry, the way she had moved through card catalogs for 30 years, and through Eleanor's closets for the 3 years since understanding that the right answer was findable if you were patient and systematic and did not skip anything because it seemed unlikely. The house had 7 doors with keyholes she could identify, and she worked through all 7 before she stopped. None of them matched. Daniel returned at mid-afternoon with Patricia, who had brought lunch. Ruth recognized the lunch as a gesture of softening the practical kindness that preceded the return to the subject that had not been resolved. She accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was genuine, even if it was also strategic, because Daniel and Patricia were her children, and their love and their calculation were not separate things, but the same thing expressed in different registers. They sat at the kitchen table. Patricia had set out sandwiches and fruit, and the conversation moved around the subject in the way of families who have an unresolved thing at the center and are navigating the meal before returning to it. Patricia mentioned a community 20 minutes from her house. Her own apartment, she said. Very nice, a pool, activities. Ruth listened and nodded and kept her hands in her lap, and the key in her apron pocket throughout the iron warm, now from her body. After lunch, Patricia moved to the sink to wash the plates, which was something she never did at home but did here. Ruth had noticed when she wanted to appear helpful. Daniel took his phone to the back porch. Ruth sat at the table with her tea. Sean wandered. He was a wanderer in houses, always had been the kind of man who moved through spaces with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the details in a way that looked casual and was not. Ruth had observed this about him over the years without commenting on it. He moved through the study and into the hallway, and Ruth heard his footsteps slow and then stop. She heard him try the basement door handle. The rattle of it brief, the handle turned and meeting the resistance of the lock and released. A pause. Then his footsteps moving back toward the kitchen. He said nothing when he returned. He poured himself more coffee and leaned against the counter and looked out the window at the barn. Ruth's hand was in her apron pocket. The key was between her fingers. She thought about Eleanor in the basement. It was so thoroughly Eleanor's space that it had never registered to Ruth as a place she might enter. Eleanor had kept it locked as long as Ruth could remember the padlock on the exterior door when Ruth was a child, and the interior lock later after the renovation, and always the same pleasant firm answer when anyone asked about it. "That's my space," Eleanor would say. A person needs one space that's entirely their own. Ruth had helped carry canning jars down those stairs as a teenager once on a late summer afternoon when the kitchen smelled of vinegar and preserved peaches. Eleanor had locked the door behind them, and Ruth had looked around at the shelves of jars and the old workbench and the single light bulb on its cord, and Eleanor had said without being asked, "This basement has held 60 years of this family. Everything important to me is down here." Ruth had thought she meant the preserves. She waited until she was alone. Patricia and Sean left, first Patricia kissing Ruth's cheek and saying they would talk tomorrow, and Daniel lingered at the door the way he did when he wanted to say something more and could not find it, and then he left too, and his car went down the lane and the house was quiet. Ruth stood before the basement door. The door was plain wood, the original door with the original hardware, a keyhole plate of iron that was the same age as everything else in this house that Eleanor had refused to modernize because she said old things that still worked did not require improvement. Ruth put the key in the lock. It turned. Cleanly without resistance, the way a key turns in the lock. It was made for the way a thing fits when it was always supposed to fit and has simply been waiting for the right moment. The door opened. Cool air came up from below, dry, and still the air of a space that had been closed but not neglected the particular quality of cool that belongs to a basement that has been kept rather than abandoned. It smelled of old wood and something Ruth could not immediately name, something dry and faintly sweet like paper, kept in the right conditions for a very long time. Ruth stood at the top of the stairs with one hand on the doorframe. She did not go down yet. She stood in the open doorway and looked down into the dim stillness and listened to the silence of what was below her, the quiet of a place that had been waiting, and she thought about Eleanor saying everything important to me is down here. She had thought she meant the preserves. She had been wrong about that for 50 years. She did not go down that night. She closed the basement door and turned the key and stood in the hallway holding it for a long time. The iron warm now from her hand, the house quiet around her in the particular way it was quiet in the evenings, settled and breathing the old wood and plaster, holding the day's warmth the way old houses hold everything slowly and without letting go. Whatever Eleanor had meant by this, whatever was down those stairs in that locked and tended space, it would wait one more night. Ruth had learned in 78 years that the things worth finding were also worth approaching with care. Some things deserve daylight and a clear head, and the quiet certainty that comes from a full night of sitting with a decision before you act on it. She put the key in the small dish on her nightstand where she would see it first thing, and she went to bed. Daniel called before 8. His voice had the prepared quality it carried when he had rehearsed the opening, the tone of a man who had decided on his approach before dialing. The developer's window was closing Friday. The offer would not hold past the weekend. He just needed a yes or a no, he said. That was all he was asking. Ruth told him she would have an answer by Friday. Daniel was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone recalculating, reordering the sequence of what he had planned to say. "Fine," he said. "Friday." She thanked him and set the phone on the table and poured her second cup of coffee and sat in Eleanor's chair in the amber morning light and thought about the word Friday, the way you think about a deadline when you understand that the deadline belongs to someone else's timeline and not your own. Maggie Fields arrived at 10 with coffee cake on a plate covered with waxed paper, the way Maggie brought things practically, and without announcement the way of a woman who had been a neighbor for 11 years and had earned the right to arrive without calling first. She was 75 years old, and she had the direct manner of someone who had stopped softening things she did not need to soften and had found life considerably simpler since. She sat down at the kitchen table and cut 2 pieces of the cake and listened while Ruth told her about the key. Not everything, not the basement door yet, just the coat and the cloth and the handwriting and the weight of the thing in her palm. Maggie listened the way she always listened, with her full attention, not preparing her response while Ruth was still talking. When Ruth finished, Maggie set her fork down on the plate. She said Eleanor Hayes was the sharpest woman I ever knew in my life. If she left you a key, Ruth, she left you something worth unlocking. Ruth had already decided, but it helped to hear it said aloud by someone who had known Eleanor and was not related to anything at stake. Patricia arrived at noon. She had not called ahead. She appeared at the door with the explanation that she wanted to help organize said in the tone of someone who considers their presence a gift, and Ruth stepped aside and let her in because Patricia was her daughter, and Ruth had not yet arrived at the place where she would stop doing that. Patricia moved through the house with the focused energy of someone taking inventory. Not with a clipboard or any instrument that would have made the intention visible, just with her eyes and her hands opening cabinets in the kitchen with a casualness that was not casual, running her fingers along the built-in shelving in the study, pausing in doorways to look at rooms with the slightly unfocused gaze of someone calculating dimensions. Ruth watched from the kitchen doorway without expression. She watched Patricia move through the living room and stop at the mantel. The photographs were arranged there the way they had always been arranged, the family in its chronology, the older ones in the back, and the more recent ones in front. Patricia picked up the photograph of Ruth and Harold on their 35th anniversary, standing in front of this house in the good summer light, both of them squinting slightly, and Harold's hand on Ruth's shoulder, in the way he always stood beside her as if the contact were natural and necessary. Patricia's thumb moved along the edge of the frame. She said, "We'll want to move these to storage when the sale goes through." Ruth looked at her daughter. She looked at her for a long moment at the face she had held in her hands when it was 3 days old at the woman Patricia had become, who was not a cruel woman, but was a woman who had learned to want things efficiently and had forgotten somewhere along the way to notice the cost of efficiency on the people around her. Eleanor had said it once when Patricia was 12, pulling Ruth aside after a summer afternoon visit. "Your girl has her father's practicality," Eleanor had said. "That's not a bad thing, Ruth, but make sure she learns his kindness too." Ruth had thought about that observation briefly at the time and had not thought about it in the 30 years since. She was thinking about it now. She said quietly, "I haven't agreed to anything yet, Patricia." Patricia smiled with her mouth only. She set the photograph back on the mantel and moved toward the hallway, and Ruth watched her stop at the basement door and try the handle and find it locked and move on without comment the way people move on from locked doors when they have assessed them as unimportant. Ruth said nothing. After Patricia left, the house went quiet, in the way it went quiet when it had held too much activity and was settling back into itself. Ruth stood in the kitchen and finished her cold coffee and looked at the key in the small dish where she had placed it that morning. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. She picked up the key. She walked to the basement door. She put the key in the lock and turned it and reached for the light switch at the top of the stairs and pressed it. The bulb came on. She went down. The basement was not what she had expected. She had expected the benign disorder of an old woman's storage, the accumulation of things that had outlived their purpose, but not their owner's reluctance to release them. She had expected dust and damp and the particular sadness of spaces that have been closed too long. What she found was order. The room was clean and dry, the kind of dry that comes from deliberate weatherproofing rather than luck. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls solid and level, built with the same care Eleanor applied to everything she built or maintained. On the shelves, metal containers labeled by year, their lids sealed. Filing boxes in a row along the lower shelf, dated in Eleanor's handwriting going back 30 years. Everything arranged with the intention of someone who had been planning for a specific future and had been preparing the space to serve that future when it arrived. Ruth stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at it. She had been in this basement once as a teenager helping carry canning jars down on a hot August afternoon. She had stood in this same spot and looked around, and Eleanor had said, "This basement has held 60 years of this family. Everything important to me is down here." Ruth had thought she meant the preserves. The preserves were here, but they were not what Eleanor had meant. At the center of the back wall on a wooden work table that had been built into the wall with the same carpenter's care as the shelves, a single cardboard box sat under the overhead light. Not dusty, not old and forgotten. Placed there with intention, with the particular deliberateness of something positioned to be found. In Eleanor's handwriting, large and careful and unmistakable across the top of the box, "Ruth, legal, do not open except with attorney or after my death." Ruth walked across the basement floor, her footsteps quiet on the concrete, and sat down on the wooden stool beside the work table. She looked at the box. The overhead light fell across Eleanor's handwriting and across Ruth's hands, resting on her knees, and across the clean surface of the work table that Eleanor had kept ready for exactly this. Eleanor had written those words at some point in some year with full knowledge that Ruth would eventually be the one sitting here reading them. She had planned for this room and this box and this moment with the same patience and foresight she had applied to everything in her life that mattered. The question was how long she had been planning it. Ruth reached forward and opened the box. The scene held on her face, on the stillness of it, on the expression of a woman who has just looked at something that answers a question she did not know she had been asking for 30 years. Inside the box were 3 sealed envelopes, a legal-sized document folder tied with a dark ribbon, an attorney's business card clipped to the outside flap with a paper clip that had oxidized to a dull bronze, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a letter, unsealed. Ruth's name on the front, in Eleanor's handwriting, the letters unhurried and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had written things down her entire life because she understood that written things outlasted the moment of their writing. Ruth picked up the letter first. She carried it to the bottom of the basement stairs and sat down on the second step and held it in both hands and opened it in the light from the overhead bulb. Eleanor had written the date at the top. Not a scrawl, not a shorthand, but a full date written out, as if she wanted there to be no ambiguity about when she had sat down with her pen and thought about Ruth and begun. 7 years ago. Eleanor had been 87 years old and had sat down at some table in this house and written 4 pages front and back in the careful, unhurried hand she had used her entire life. She began simply, "Ruth, if you are reading this, then I have been gone long enough for you to find the coat. I am glad you kept it." Ruth sat on the basement step and read, "Eleanor wrote about the farmhouse the way you write about something you have loved for a long time, with the specific tenderness of a person who knows every corner of a thing and has stopped needing to explain that knowledge to anyone. She wrote about buying it with Robert in 1961, the two of them young and certain in the way of people who have found the right place and recognize it without requiring confirmation. She wrote about staying after Robert passed the years alone in the house, the way aloneness and solitude were not the same thing, and she had spent a long time learning the difference. She wrote about the grandchildren. She wrote about watching them visit over the years, how she had watched with the particular attention of an old woman who has stopped performing observation and simply observes how she had watched slowly and with great clarity as each of them revealed who they were in relation to the house, who came to be with her and who came to be somewhere, who sat in the kitchen in the morning and who wandered the rooms with the slightly unfocused attention of someone calculating. I watched how you sat with me, Ruth, not to get something, just to sit." Ruth read that sentence twice, then she continued. Eleanor wrote about the years of Harold's illness. She wrote about watching Ruth drive 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon with soup she had made that morning and stay 4 days without once mentioning the inconvenience of it. She wrote about watching Daniel and Patricia's visits grow shorter, and then infrequent, and then occasional in the way that adult children's visits become occasional when they have their own lives and have decided that their parents are stable enough to require less attention. She wrote about watching Ruth never once mention this. I watched how your children stopped coming, Eleanor had written, and I watched how you never said a word about it. Not to me, not to anyone I could see. You just kept showing up. I want you to know that I saw it. I want you to know that it was not invisible to me even when you were trying to make it invisible. Ruth sat with that paragraph for a moment. The basement was quiet around her, the shelves and the filing boxes and the metal containers standing in their orderly rows, and outside through the small, high window she could see the pale afternoon light and the edge of the far field and the particular stillness of an October afternoon. She turned to the second page. Eleanor had consulted an attorney 15 years ago. She wrote about it matter-of-factly, the way she wrote about all practical decisions she had made, with full intention, not as a confession or a revelation, but as an explanation of something that had been in place for a long time and was now being disclosed. She had created a revocable living trust properly drawn and legally sound and fully notarized, and she had placed the farmhouse and the surrounding 42 acres in that trust with one sole beneficiary, Ruth Ellen Calloway. The trust had become irrevocable upon Eleanor's death. The property had transferred automatically legally without probate on the day Eleanor passed. Ruth owned the farmhouse. She had owned it for 4 years. Her children had no legal claim. They had never had one. Eleanor had written the next paragraph with the plainness of someone who has thought through a thing completely and is now simply reporting what they know. "I imagine they will come for it," she wrote. "People who have not visited in years have a way of becoming very interested in property when someone dies. I am not bitter about this. I have lived long enough to understand how people are when there is something to be gotten. I just know how it works. That is why I made sure the law was arranged before I left. Not through sentiment, not through argument, through paperwork. They cannot take it through emotion or pressure or documents of their own devising. The law is on your side, Ruth. I spent 15 years making sure of that." Ruth read that paragraph the way you read something that rearranges what you thought you were sitting in the middle of. She read it and then looked at the filing boxes on the shelf and the organized years of Eleanor's careful preparation and thought about her daughter moving through the living room that afternoon, touching things with the casual, proprietary attention of someone who believes they already own something. She turned to the 3rd page. Eleanor had written about the house itself. She wrote its history in the precise way of someone who understood that a house's value was not in its square footage, but in its accumulated story, and she had compiled that story as if she knew the house would need a defender someday and was making sure that defender would be armed. Every repair made since 1961, who had made it and when, the herb garden and the rosemary bush and the summer she had planted them and why. The names carved in the pantry doorframe where her children had marked their heights over decades, and whose marks were whose. In the 2nd sealed envelope Eleanor had written is a savings account established in your name 11 years ago. $38,000. She had paused here. Ruth could feel the pause in the writing, the slight shift in the pressure of the pen. Not a fortune, Eleanor had written. I know that. But enough for you to choose. Not to survive, Ruth. To choose. There is a difference. I need you to know the difference, and I need you to use it like you know it. Ruth set the 3rd page on her knee and looked at the basement wall. She remembered the last time she had seen Eleanor alive. 3 months before she died, an early morning visit, the two of them in the kitchen in the pale winter light with coffee. They were both letting go, cold. Eleanor had looked at her with the steady gaze she had always had, the gaze of someone who has decided to see clearly and has been practicing it for 91 years, and had said very quietly, "You have been a good woman, Ruth. I need you to know I see that." Ruth had brushed it off, had changed the subject to something practical, the weather, the drive back, something that did not require her to receive what Eleanor was offering. She had always done this, deflected the direct acknowledgement of herself, and Eleanor had let her deflect, and had loved her anyway, and had then sat down at a table and written 4 pages to make sure that love arrived somewhere. Ruth could not deflect it. She wished now that she had let Eleanor finish. She wished she had simply sat with it. She read the 4th page. At the bottom, Eleanor had written one more thing. She had written, "I know you will feel guilty about this. I know you will think about Daniel and Patricia and wonder if I was unfair to them. I want you to answer that question for yourself, Ruth. Think about who sat with me. Think about who came when I called. Think about who learned the name of my doctor and the name of my neighbor and the name of the cat that visited the back porch for 3 years and that I fed every morning. Think about who knew those things. Then decide if I was unfair." Ruth sat on the basement step for a long time after she finished. The overhead light was steady above her. The house was quiet upstairs, the afternoon settling into early evening, the amber light that had been in the kitchen that morning now gone to the gray of October dusk. She reached into the box and picked up the legal document folder. She untied the dark ribbon with hands that were steady, which surprised her, and opened the folder and spread the trust document on the work table. It was dense and formal, the language of legal instruments that meant what they said. and had been written to be unambiguous, and her name was at the top of the first page, and again at the top of the beneficiary designation, and again in the transfer clause that specified what happened to the property upon Eleanor's death. At the bottom of the final page in the margin in Eleanor's handwriting, a note so small she almost missed it. "The attorney's card is still good. I checked every 3 years. Call him." Ruth picked up the business card from the work table. James Whitfield, estate and trust attorney, a phone number and an address in town. She looked at her watch. 3:40 in the afternoon. She picked up the sealed envelope with the savings account information and set it on top of the trust documents without opening it. She picked up the attorney's card and held it in one hand and stood up from the stool. Eleanor had not just left her a house. She had left her a plan. A complete and carefully maintained plan checked every 3 years, kept current, kept ready, kept waiting for the moment when Ruth would come down the stairs and find it. Ruth went upstairs to call. James Whitfield answered on the second ring. His voice was older than the business card, but steady, the voice of a man who had been doing careful work for a long time and had developed the particular, unhurried quality of someone who understood that precision was more valuable than speed. Ruth introduced herself and told him her grandmother had been Eleanor Hayes. There was a brief pause, not the pause of someone who did not recognize the name, but the pause of someone setting down what they were doing and giving their full attention to what was beginning. "He said Mrs. Hayes updated my contact information every 3 years. She told me someone named Ruth would call eventually." Ruth asked him how long he had been expecting the call. He said since the day she passed. He asked her to hold while he retrieved the file. He was back in under 2 minutes, which told her the file had not been buried or misfiled or treated as the concluded business of a deceased client. It had been kept where it could be found quickly because Eleanor had told him it would be needed. The trust had been properly established, he said. Structured as a revocable living trust, converted to irrevocable upon Eleanor's death, which had occurred 4 years ago. The farmhouse and surrounding 42 acres had been placed in the trust 15 years prior and had transferred automatically to the sole name beneficiary on the date of Eleanor's passing. "He said your name is on the county property record as sole title holder, has been since the date of Mrs. Hayes' passing." Ruth said, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" He repeated it. She stood at the kitchen counter with the phone against her ear and looked at the window above the sink and the October fields beyond it. The late afternoon light moving across the grass in the slow way of light that has decided it is almost finished for the day, and she let the words settle into the correct places inside her. For 3 years she had been living in her own house without knowing it. For 3 years she had been the person who kept it, who oiled the cabinets and replanted the herb garden and trimmed the rosemary bush Eleanor had called the guardian, and she had been doing all of that as a guest in a house that had been hers since the week Eleanor died. Whitfield continued in the same precise voice, laying out what the trust meant in practical terms, with the care of someone who understood that legal language required translation to be useful. The transfer had bypassed probate entirely. There had been no estate proceeding for the property because the property had not been part of Eleanor's estate. It had already belonged to Ruth. Any sale agreement signed by Ruth's children, any development offer accepted on their behalf, any document they had been preparing with the expectation of selling property they believed to be available would be legally void from the moment it was signed. They had no authority to negotiate the sale of property that had never been theirs to negotiate. There was a brief pause on the line. Whitfield said in the careful tone of a man framing a legal question with precision, did they attempt to negotiate a sale? Ruth told him about the papers on the kitchen table, the developer's offer, the Friday deadline, Daniel's phone calls, and the tone of someone who had decided the outcome before the conversation began. Patricia moving through the rooms with her inventory eyes. There was a longer pause this time. Whitfield said, "Mrs. Calloway, you should be aware that attempting to represent oneself as having authority to sell property, one does not own particularly to a third-party developer, and in writing is a matter your children may want to discuss with their own counsel." Ruth did not respond to that. She understood what he was saying, and she understood what she would do with it and what she would not do with it. And she needed a moment to let the shape of it settle before she knew for certain. She thanked him. He gave her his direct number and told her to call if she needed anything in writing, which she would, and he said he was glad she had found the file and that Mrs. Hayes had been in his 30 years of practice one of the most deliberate clients he had ever worked with. Ruth asked him what he meant by deliberate. He said most clients make arrangements and hope they will hold. Mrs. Hayes made arrangements and then checked every 3 years to make sure nothing had changed in the law that might affect them. She called me on schedule. Never missed a year. He paused. She told me once that she was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of leaving something unfinished. He paused again. I don't believe she left anything unfinished. Ruth thanked him and set the phone on the counter. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The fields were catching the last of the afternoon light, the way Eleanor's fields had always caught it amber and gold across the grass. The old fence line dark against the paling sky. The barn at the far edge of the property, sitting in the particular stillness of a structure that has been standing in the same place for a very long time and has no intention of stopping. The farmhouse held the evening light in its brick and in its old wood and in the rosemary bush by the front door that was still green in October because Eleanor had planted it in the right place and Ruth had tended it the way Eleanor had shown her. She thought about Harold. She thought about the last months of his illness, the way he had been too proud to acknowledge how much he could not manage and too sick to manage it regardless, and she had handled all of it quietly, the appointments and the bills and the paperwork and the phone calls and the 100 small tasks that accumulate around a person's diminishment and require someone who will do them without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement for the doing. She had done all of it. Eleanor had known. Eleanor had been watching from whatever distance she watched, from which was never very far, and she had known the shape of Ruth's life with Harold, the way she seemed to have known the shape of Ruth's life with her children, which was to say completely and without being told. Ruth wondered not for the first time, and with more weight now than before, whether Eleanor and Harold had spoken about her, whether in some conversation she had not been present for two people who loved her, had looked at each other, and understood that she would need something she would not ask for, and had decided between them that someone should make sure she had it. She would never know. Some questions had no recoverable answer, but she held the possibility of it and found it was not a sad thing but a warm one. Maggie arrived at 6 with a covered dish as she did sometimes without announcement, the easy generosity of a friend who has stopped needing permission to be useful. Ruth let her in, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Ruth laid out the letter and the trust documents without commentary, smoothing them flat on the table, the way you arrange things you want another person to be able to read without obstruction. Maggie read slowly. She read the letter first, all 4 pages, and Ruth watched her face move through the reading the way a face moves when it is following something that matters. When she finished the letter, she read the summary page of the trust document and then looked at the county property record that Whitfield had said he would send to her email within the hour, which she had printed at Eleanor's old printer in the study, Ruth's name at the top, in the clean typeface of an official record. Maggie set the last page down on the table. She looked up. She said she knew. She knew exactly what was going to happen. Ruth said yes. Maggie said, "What are you going to do?" Ruth looked at the documents on the table. At Eleanor's letter beside the trust, beside the county record with her name on it, 4 years of being the owner of a thing without knowing it, 4 years of tending and keeping and staying because staying was what you did when a place was yours. In the ways that mattered before, you knew it was yours in the ways that were legal. She said, "I'm going to answer Daniel's call on Friday. And I'm going to tell him I have an answer." Maggie looked at her for a moment. Then the expression that crossed her face was not triumphant and not amused, but something quieter and more complete than either of those things. The expression of a woman who has watched her friend be underestimated for 11 years and has been waiting without knowing she was waiting for this particular evening. Ruth did not need a celebration. The look on Maggie's face was the only one she needed. Outside, the last light was leaving the fields. The farmhouse settled into the evening with the sounds it made when the day was finished, the old wood finding its resting position, the familiar small sounds of a house that knew itself. Eleanor had not left her a fortune. She had left her something more difficult to take away. She had left her a house that was legally, officially, and permanently hers, and $38,000 so that hers meant something, and 4 pages of handwritten truth so that she would know why, and an attorney who had been answering the phone every 3 years for 15 years to make sure that when the moment came, everything would hold. Ruth gathered the documents into a careful stack and put them back in the box. Friday was 2 days away. She was ready. Friday arrived cloudless and still. Ruth woke before 5 and lay in the dark for a few minutes listening to the house, the familiar small sounds of old wood and settled plaster, the way the farmhouse breathed in the cold hours before dawn. Then she got up and put on her robe and went downstairs and made coffee and carried it out to the porch. Eleanor's rocking chair was where it had always been, facing east, positioned with the deliberate precision of a woman who understood that the direction you faced in the morning mattered. Ruth sat in it and wrapped both hands around her mug and watched the sun come up over the east field. The light came slowly, the way October light came, without hurry, the dark giving way to gray, and then to the pale gold that preceded the full morning. The field caught it the way Eleanor's fields had always caught it. The grass moving slightly in the early cold, the fence line emerging from the dark in gradual detail, the barn at the far edge of the property, the old apple tree at the corner of the herb garden, the rosemary bush by the front door green still holding its shape against the season. Ruth sat in Eleanor's chair and watched her farm come into the morning and felt for the first time in weeks the uncomplicated steadiness of a woman who knows what is true and is prepared to say it. Daniel called at 9. His voice had the prepared quality of someone who had organized their words the night before and was now delivering them in the order they had been arranged. "Good morning, Mom. So, we need an answer today. The offer window closes at 5. I know this has been a lot," but he paused here, the pause of someone about to deliver the reasonable conclusion to a reasonable set of considerations. "But I really think when you look at it clearly," Ruth said, "I have an answer." A pause. She could hear Patricia in the background, the faint sound of movement, someone who had been waiting close to the phone. Ruth said, "I'm not selling the house, Daniel." A longer pause, the kind of pause that has more than silence in it. He said, "Mom, we talked about this. The offer is—" Ruth said, "The house is mine. It was mine before you came with those papers. It was mine for 3 years before you came. Your grandmother placed it in a trust 15 years ago with my name on it. The county has held that record since the day she died." Silence. Then Daniel's voice, smaller than she had ever heard it in 52 years, smaller than it had been when he was a boy and something had gone wrong and he could not find the words for it. He said, "What trust?" Ruth said, "The one Eleanor made when she decided who would care for this house." She paused. It wasn't a difficult decision, apparently. She let that sit for a moment, not cruelly but honestly, the way you let a true thing sit when it has earned its place in the conversation. Then she told him she would like them to come for lunch, not to argue, she said, to see the documents for themselves. She said it pleasantly and without the edge that the situation might have permitted her to use, because Eleanor had not left her a weapon and she had no intention of making it one. She said Maggie would be there. She said she would make coffee, and there was cake. She waited. A pause. Then Daniel said, "We'll be there by noon." In the 40 minutes between the phone call and their arrival, Ruth set the table and sliced Maggie's coffee cake and brewed a fresh pot and placed the trust documents in the center of the kitchen table. Not fanned out for effect, not arranged dramatically, just placed the way you place a fact that does not require presentation because it is sufficient on its own terms. Eleanor's letter lay beside the documents, unfolded the 4 pages in order. Maggie arrived at 11:30 and stood at the table and looked at the arrangement and looked at Ruth. She said, "Are you all right?" Ruth said yes. Maggie said, "You look very calm." Ruth said, "I am very calm." Maggie sat down and poured herself coffee, and they waited together in the quiet kitchen, the morning light coming through the window in the amber sheet that landed on Eleanor's chair. And Ruth thought about her mother at the hospital the day Daniel was born, leaning in over the bundle of him to say, "He's going to challenge you. They all do. That doesn't mean you stop loving them." She had held that sentence for 52 years, the way you hold something that turns out to be more useful than you understood when you received it. She held it now, Patricia came in first. She came in with the energy she always carried, the forward motion of a woman who had prepared her response before she arrived, who had spent the drive composing the counter-argument and was ready to deploy it. She came into the kitchen and she stopped. She looked at the table. She looked at the documents in the center and at Eleanor's letter unfolded beside them. She crossed to the table slowly and looked at the letter for a moment, and then she picked it up. The kitchen went completely quiet. Ruth did not watch Patricia's face with any intention of cataloging what moved across it. She simply sat at her end of the table with her coffee and let the room be what it was, which was a kitchen where a woman was reading a letter from her grandmother's grandmother that had been written 7 years ago with complete knowledge of this exact morning. Patricia read all 4 pages. She read them the way you read something when you are not skimming for the useful parts, but following each sentence as it arrives, because each sentence is arriving with weight. When she set the letter down, her hands were not quite steady. She said half to herself she planned all of this. Ruth said yes. Patricia said she never said anything to us. Ruth said no, she didn't. The words were not an accusation. They were simply true, and Ruth said them the way Eleanor would have said them, plainly and without decoration, because the truth did not require decoration to land. Sean had come to the door but had not come in. He stood in the hallway with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor in the way of a man who has understood something about the situation and has decided that the hallway is the correct place for him. Daniel came in last. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the documents, at his mother's name printed at the top of the county property record, at the trust document with its formal language and its notarized signatures and the date that was 15 years in the past. He looked at all of it for a moment. Then he looked at his mother. He did not look at the documents again. He looked at Ruth, at the woman who had made coffee and set the table and sliced the cake and waited on the porch in Eleanor's rocking chair for the morning to come. And in his face, for the first time since this had begun, there was something other than the prepared impatience of a man managing a situation. Ruth looked back at him and did not fill the silence. She had not planned this moment. She had not rehearsed it or imagined what she would say when it came. She had simply been willing to let the truth arrive at its own pace and in its own form, which was Eleanor's way, which Ruth had learned without knowing she was learning it over 78 years of watching a woman who understood that the quietest things were often the ones that held the longest. The kitchen was still. Outside, the east field lay in the full morning light gold, and unhurried the farmhouse holding the day the way it had held every day for 60 years. Eleanor's letter was on the table. The table was Ruth's. All of it was Ruth's. And in the room, in the silence, Daniel and Patricia were beginning to understand what they had failed to see. The development offer expired at 5 o'clock on Friday. No one called to extend it. The company moved on to another parcel, 2 counties over, as Daniel confirmed 2 weeks later in a phone call that was noticeably quieter than his previous ones. The careful neutrality of a man who has put down something heavy and is not yet sure what to do with his hands. Ruth said she was sorry it hadn't worked out for him. She meant it in the way you can mean something, and also understand that its not working out was necessary. Daniel said it was fine, and that there were other projects, and Ruth listened to him say this, and understood that he was telling himself something as much as he was telling her. There were no dramatic scenes after the kitchen table. No speeches, no perfect apologies, no moment where everything collapsed into clarity and resolution and the particular emotional tidiness that life rarely provides. Ruth had not expected any of that. She had lived 78 years, and she understood that the large things resolved in small increments imperfectly over time, and that the resolution was less important than the direction. Patricia called 3 days later. "Not about the house." Ruth recognized the difference in her voice before she said a word, the way a register shifts when a person has set down the thing they were carrying and is calling from a different place than the one they usually called from. Patricia said she had read Eleanor's letter twice more since Friday. She said she couldn't stop thinking about the part where Eleanor described watching the family over the years, the careful observations Eleanor had kept to herself for decades, the quiet accumulation of who came and who didn't, and who sat beside her and who moved through her house with their eyes on something other than her. Patricia said I didn't know she noticed all that. Her voice was different, not soft. Patricia was never entirely soft, but less armored than usual, the voice of a woman who has encountered something that got through the armor before she had time to adjust for it. Ruth listened. She did not offer Patricia the reassurance of being told it was fine, or that Eleanor would have understood, or any of the easy consolations that would have made the moment smaller than it was. But she did not withhold herself either. She simply stayed on the line and let Patricia say what she needed to say, which was not much, but was more than she had said in a long time. When they hung up, Ruth stood in the kitchen for a moment. She thought it was a beginning of something, though she could not have said exactly what. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the beginning was all you could ask for at the start. Daniel came alone on a Saturday 3 weeks after Friday. No Patricia, no Sean. Just Daniel in his car pulling into the driveway at 10 in the morning and sitting there for several minutes before he got out. Ruth had seen him from the kitchen window. She had watched his car sit at the end of the drive with the engine off and the shape of him visible through the windshield, just sitting the way a person sits when they are preparing themselves for something that does not have a script. She had watched him for a moment, and then she had turned to the stove and put on coffee because that was the right thing to do, and she knew how to do the right thing without being asked. He came in and sat at the table, and she set a mug in front of him, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about the house, not about the trust or the development offer or the documents or the Friday that had passed without resolution in the way Daniel had intended. They talked about Harold, about the particular way Harold had moved through the world quietly and with his hands fixing things without announcing that he was fixing them. They talked about Eleanor, about the summer Daniel was 11 and had ridden his bicycle into Eleanor's back fence gate and broken the latch off entirely and had been certain he would be spoken to about it, and Eleanor had never said a word, had simply fixed it herself the same afternoon while Daniel was still at the farm. He had not known she knew. And then 20 years later, on her 92nd birthday, Eleanor had mailed him a photograph. The back fence gate perfectly maintained, standing straight in the afternoon light. On the back in her handwriting, 4 words. It held, "Love, Eleanor." Daniel laughed about that for a long time. Not the polite laugh of someone performing ease, but the real laugh. The laugh that comes from somewhere that has been closed for a while and is open again. Ruth laughed too, and the kitchen held the sound of it, the way old kitchens hold sounds warmly and without judgment. He did not apologize directly. That was his way, had always been his way. The way of a man who expressed remorse through presence, rather than through words. Ruth understood this about him. She had understood it since he was small. She did not need the words. What she needed was sitting at her kitchen table and drinking her coffee and talking about his grandmother with something other than strategy in his voice. When Ruth told Maggie later, Maggie said that's all some people can give. Ruth thought that was about right. Whitfield sent a letter suggesting Ruth come in to discuss her own estate planning, just to ensure everything remained clear and properly structured going forward. Ruth made the appointment for a Thursday afternoon and drove herself through the county roads that were bare now in November, the fields on either side going the particular gray gold of late autumn. The meeting was brief and practical and reassuring in the way of things that have been built correctly and simply need to be confirmed. Whitfield shook her hand at the door and said Eleanor would be pleased, and Ruth said she thought so too. On the drive home, she thought about Harold. She thought about the way he had moved through the house over the years, quietly and without announcement, replacing the porch railing the summer it started to give, recaulking the kitchen window each autumn before the cold came in, fixing the gate latch the year it stuck so badly they had to lift the gate to open it. Just things that needed doing, he would say, when she noticed, just keeping things from falling. Some people expressed love through maintenance, through attending to the small deteriorations before they became large ones, through ensuring year after year without asking for credit that what they loved would hold against time. Eleanor had done that. Harold had done that. Ruth pulled into the farmhouse drive and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house in the evening light. The rosemary bush by the front door, the east field going dark at the edges, The old barn at the far end of the property, standing as it had stood for 60 years, its shape familiar against the November sky. She got out of the car and walked to the porch and sat down in Eleanor's rocking chair. She looked at the east field in the last of the light. It held, she thought. Eleanor had built something. Not just a trust. Not just a legal instrument that had done its work and prevented a wrong. Something larger and quieter than that. Something that had been in the making for decades, and that Ruth was only now understanding the full shape of. It held, and it would go on holding. That September, Ruth planted Eleanor's herb garden again. The lavender and the rosemary and the sage, the same plants Eleanor had tended in the same beds for 40 years. The plants that smelled like every morning Ruth could remember in that house. She had put off the replanting all summer, not from neglect, but from something she could not entirely name, a sense that the ground was not ready, or that she was not ready, or that some things needed to wait for the right season in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. Now, with the trust settled and Whitfield's paperwork filed and Daniel's visits becoming a more regular thing, something had settled inside her, too. The garden felt possible again. She went to the nursery on a Tuesday morning and bought the starts, and came home and changed into her old clothes and went out to the beds with her trowel. Maggie arrived 20 minutes later with her own garden gloves and a pot of coffee, which was the way Maggie helped with things, by showing up already equipped and not asking whether she was needed. They worked through the morning in the easy quiet of two women who had known each other long enough to not require conversation to fill the time. The September air was cool, and the ground was soft from an early rain, and the smell of the turned earth and the lavender was the smell of the house made external, the same smell that came from the kitchen in the early mornings, and from the hallway, and from Eleanor's coat on the hook. After a while, Ruth found herself saying things aloud that she had not said before. About Eleanor dancing with Harold at their wedding, the two of them on the floor until midnight, while everyone else sat down, Eleanor in her good blue dress laughing at something Harold had said. About Eleanor calling every Sunday for 40 years without exception, the call always at the same time, always beginning the same way, always ending with the same words, which were, "You're all right and I love you," in that order, as if the confirmation needed to precede the declaration. About a letter Ruth had written to Eleanor during the years when her children were young, and she was exhausted in the particular way of a woman who is doing everything and telling herself she should be doing it better. She had written in a rare moment of honesty that she was not sure she was doing any of it right. She had not expected a useful response. Eleanor was not a woman who trafficked in reassurance. Eleanor had written back 3 days later. Ruth had memorized the response without intending to. "You are doing all of it right. You are still there. That is what right looks like." Maggie pressed the last lavender start into the earth and sat back on her heels and said she really knew you. Ruth said she did. She paused. "I think she knew me better than I knew myself." After Maggie left, Ruth went back to the basement. Not for the documents which were upstairs, now organized in the file box she had labeled with the same deliberate care Eleanor had used for everything. She went back because she had noticed on her last visit a shelf in the far corner she had not fully examined behind a row of metal containers, a shelf she had passed without looking at because she had been focused on the work table and the box Eleanor had left for her. Now she went to it. Old photograph frames mostly, and album covers, and the miscellany of a life documented across decades, and one small wooden box plain with a simple clasp that she had not opened. She brought it to the work table and opened it under the overhead light. Inside photographs. Eleanor Young in the yard in the early 1960s, squinting slightly in the summer light, wearing the kind of dress people wore for ordinary days then. Eleanor and Robert by the porch steps, Robert's arm around her, both of them looking at the camera with the easy comfort of people who have been standing beside each other for a long time and have stopped noticing they are doing it. Eleanor at 90, standing at the kitchen window in the amber morning light, the same angle, the same window, the same light that Ruth had stood in every morning for 3 years without knowing it was Eleanor's particular light at Eleanor's particular hour. Ruth went through the photographs slowly, the way she went through everything that mattered without hurrying. At the bottom of the box was a photograph she did not recognize at first. A young woman, perhaps 30, standing at the farmhouse porch with a baby on her hip and a small child beside her. The child's hand loosely held the child, looking not at the camera, but at something in the yard, absorbed and attentive in the way of a child who has found the world entirely sufficient for her attention. Ruth looked at the young woman. She looked at the baby. She looked at the small child, looking at something in the yard with that focused, absorbed gaze. She turned the photograph over. Eleanor's handwriting in the ink that had faded to the color of old tea, but was still entirely legible. Ruth, age 3. She always knew where to look. Ruth sat down on the basement floor. She had been in this house as a child. She had stood on this porch before she had any memory of standing on it, before she had the language for porches or farmhouses, or the particular quality of morning light that landed on a chair in a kitchen and told you where you were. She had been brought here and had looked at something in the yard with her full attention, the way children look at things before they learn to look away. And Eleanor had been watching and had lifted a camera and had kept the photograph for 75 years. Eleanor had known from the beginning, not from the beginning of the trust, or the beginning of the legal planning, or the beginning of the careful preparation she had undertaken to make sure Ruth would be protected. From the beginning of Ruth, from the morning a 3-year-old stood on her porch and looked at something in the yard with the attention of a person who recognized a place. Eleanor had looked at that child and known something Ruth herself would not understand for 75 years. Ruth sat on the basement floor with the photograph in her hands and the wooden box open beside her and the light from the overhead bulb falling across everything. She thought about Eleanor in her final days, the hospital room, the particular quality of silence in that room, Eleanor's hand, finding Ruth's hand on the blanket and holding it. Eleanor had looked at her and said, "The house knows you." Ruth had not understood it then. She had smiled and squeezed Eleanor's hand and changed the subject to something practical, the way she always changed the subject when someone said something she did not know how to receive. She understood it now, completely and finally, and without any portion of it remaining unclear. She stayed in the basement until the light through the high window shifted from the flat light of afternoon to the warmer light of early evening. Then she got up slowly, the photograph in her hand, and went upstairs. She walked through the kitchen, her kitchen, the one with the amber morning light, and Eleanor's chair, and the window above the sink that faced east. She walked through the hallway past Eleanor's coat on its hook, the old charcoal wool with the small iron key still in its pocket because she had put the key back where she found it when she was done with it because it belonged there. Past the photograph of Eleanor in the garden, 1978, looking at the camera with something better than a smile. Out to the porch! She sat in Eleanor's rocking chair and held the photograph in both hands and looked at the east field as it moved through its evening colors, the gold deepening to amber, deepening to the soft gray that came before dark, the rosemary bush by the front door, the new lavender in the herb bed, small still but in the ground where it would come back in the spring, the old barn at the far edge of the property, the fence line going dark against the sky. The house was quiet around her in the way it was quiet in the evenings, the good quiet of a place that has been held and is holding. Ruth held the photograph in her lap, the small child looking at something in the yard with her full attention, Eleanor's handwriting on the back. She always knew where to look. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said. Eleanor had said it in the trust and in the letter and in the strip of cloth tied to a small iron key left in a coat pocket on a hook in a hallway. She had said it in 40 years of Sunday phone calls and in a letter that arrived when Ruth needed it most, and in a savings account established 11 years ago so that Ruth would have the means to choose. She had said it in a wooden box at the bottom of a shelf in a tended basement and in a photograph kept for 75 years. She had said it in a house carefully maintained and legally secured and left exactly where it needed to be, waiting for the person it had always been for. For Ruth, always. Ruth rocked in the old chair in the falling light, the photograph in her hands, the farm around her, quiet and present and entirely hers. She was home. She had been home for a very long time. She was only just now allowing herself to know it.